Well, in a bizarre collective act of moral inversion, Australia's leftist elites and Muslim leaders have united against Israel, creating an impression that it, not the terrorists of Hamas, are in the wrong. Now, much of the public and media has now forgotten the brutal rapes, murders of 1,200 men and women and children and the horrific kidnappings of 230 people on October 7. The truth that Israel's war of self-defence in Gaza and its extremely low civilian casualty rate, the lowest of any conflict conducted in urban warfare environments since World War II, is completely lost to the fake and wicked narrative that Israel is committing some kind of genocide in Gaza. The IDF should be receiving accolades for this achievement in urban warfare, yet instead the International Criminal Court has disgracefully called for the arrest of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defence Minister, putting them on the same moral plane as Hamas terrorist leader Yahya Sinwar, who ordered the rapes, slaughters and kidnappings of October 7. Now, we need to grapple with what is driving the demonisation of Israel and the resultant rise in anti-Semitism and what this means for Australia's social cohesion. My next guest is Dr Mark Durie. He speaks and writes on relations between monotheistic faiths, human rights and religious freedom. He's an expert on the religion of Islam. Mark, thank you so much for your time today. Mark, why is there nothing on the Australian National Imams Council website condemning the rapes, murders and kidnappings of October 7?
This is a deep issue, I think, in the way Islam works. There's a narrative at the heart of Islam that Muslims are victims and that the justification for violence done in the name of Islam is the victimhood of Muslims. So the Quran says that persecution is worse than killing. That is, persecution of Muslims or victimization of Muslims is worse than killing. So this is used as a justification of violence against non-Muslims. And in that framework, this idea that Muslims are victims, which is so deeply woven into the origin story of Islam as a justification for violence. When Muslims do violence to others and cause harm, one way in which this is processed is to say, well, their victims are at fault. These are not innocent people. So a number of Muslim commentators have said those Israeli victims, and not just Israelis, other nations as well, these people were not victims at all. They had no right of self-defense. They are evil and they deserve what happened to them. So this is the worldview that the Imam Council is coming from.
So we were talking about Australian imams, the Australian National Council of Imams, not some group in Iran or somewhere like this. But surely, whilst they might want to criticise Israel's approach to the war in Gaza, and that's something people should be free to do in a society like Australia, it seems odd to me that they can't find themselves to condemn Hamas as well. And you're saying that's because of their worldview.
That's right. They see Muslims as victims, and they see Hamas as a defender of Muslims and of the Muslim cause. So they'd be very unwilling to criticise Hamas in any significant way. And it's interesting. They've spoken up in support of New South Wales anti-incitement laws. They don't want religions to be incited against. But what they really mean is they don't want Islam to be, they don't want incitement against Muslims in Islam, but they have no problem, it seems, but judging by some of their own people to incite hatred against Jews. At least some of them have spoken, they've joined in the anti-Semitic string of sermons that we see in Sydney. So, it's a whole worldview. There's a really interesting conversation recorded from the 1920s between Marmaduke Pickthall, who was a convert to Islam, and another person. The person asked him, well, what about the genocide of the Armenians? That Muslims killed 1 million Armenians in the First World War. And he said, every time Muslims have their victims, they kill people, it's because vastly more Muslims were previously killed by others.
Okay.
And so there's a belief that only Muslims are the genuine victims, and any narrative that undermines that, so conceding any Israeli victimhood is completely anathema to the imams. That's completely beyond the pale.
Well, I think this has got to be a real worry for Australia, because there's 1 million or so Muslims now living in our country, and of course they're very welcome to live here, but we've got to have some sense of shared values, and this is what deeply concerns me. We've seen the likes of a prominent imam, Abdul Salem Zaud, a member of the Australian National Imams Council, give a sermon back in March at Sydney's Lakemba Mosque, probably the most famous mosque in Australia, where he called for jihad to restore Palestine by force. He called on Muslims to terrify Islam's enemies, to unleash the steeds of war. Mark, these don't seem like peaceful metaphors, and yet we're told by Muslim leaders all the time that Islam is a religion of peace. That's a question that I'd really love an answer to.
Yes, he was very clear that he was talking about conquest and was very proud of Islam's history of conquest. The word Islam is based on a root, which is from which the Arabic salam, which is often translated peace, comes. And so in response to the violence, which is a significant part of Islam and always has been down through history, one of the responses for Muslims as they've encountered the West and lived in the West is to downplay that and to say, oh, Islam is peace. But actually, the word Islam actually means submission or safety through surrender. So it's the peace that comes when people surrender. And it's actually a very different concept from peace. I think a fundamental issue is that Islam divides human beings into two categories, believers and non-believers. And believers are superior and they're valued. But non-believers are considered to be sort of inherently guilty and below consideration. And that division and the terms in Arabic that are used to describe non-believers are quite derogatory. And that division is a deep challenge to Australia's way of life. And it's a deep challenge to the idea that everyone is of inherently equal value, that whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, your life is of value and needs to be respected. But that's not a perspective that that leading Australian imams seem to have.
I want to come back to what this means for Australia and our social cohesion. But before I do, I just want to play some footage that appeared on the Australian newspaper's website just this morning. Now, this is, well, I'll just play this clip and I'll just ask you a question arising from it.
هاي السماء هاي الهم.
Now, Mark, what we're seeing in that clip is Hamas terrorists with some female Israeli hostages, young women. They were described as teenagers. They're saying their prayers to Allah, I guess, and they're talking about essentially raping these women. Is this a true reflection of Islam? And if it is not, why don't Australia's Muslim leaders condemn Hamas for scenes like this?
This is the face of Islam that many Muslims would reject, but many do not, and that is in Islamic law. I mean, you've heard of the Geneva Conventions, which regulate war in the modern world, but Islam has its own laws of war. They're part of the jihad. And in the Islamic rules of war, captives become slaves, or captives of war become slaves. And female captives can be subject to what we would call rape, but in Islamic law, it is legitimate sexual activity. So the idea of the harem, you know, the Muslim harems were made up of captives of war, women that had been taken in war through violence and then sold into slavery and then used as sex slaves. So sex slavery is actually part of Islam's rules of war, and ISIS did this as well. And Hamas, the Hamas fighters understand this, and they believe that they have the right to have sex with these women. I think they were speaking about making them pregnant. So this is a extension of your lineage. You know, you can not only have up to 4 wives, but also captives of war as well. So they are applying that, and you know that's very well known. This is part of mainstream Islamic jurisprudence that women that are taken captive can be used for sex, and there's laws regulating it. It's considered to be really positive. ISIS was very proud that it had reintroduced this institution. So what you're seeing there is at one face of Islam. It's not the only face. There are many Muslims who would find this repugnant, but it is part authentic of Islam. It's something that Muhammad took part in as well.
Would it be helpful to their fellow Australians for the Imams Council to just clarify which face of Islam they represent as they live amongst us here in our nation?
Yes, it would. It would be great for Australian cohesion if they said we are totally opposed to the abuse of women in this way. This is unacceptable to Islam, but I don't believe they will do that because it would divide the Muslim community and it would divide their own support base. They're already divided. There are two Grand Muftis in Australia, two organisations of imams, but it would cause a lot of conflict. So they're not going to do that. And when Sheikh Zud, is calling for the conquest of Palestine, it's quite obvious, I think, that act, the destruction of Israel, would include thousands and thousands of events like the ones you just showed on your video. That's what they're calling for. That's what the river, from the river to the sea, actually means, that this would be repeated many, many times over.
So if a fanatic got up in St Mary's Cathedral here in Sydney and preached violence against a particular ethnic group or nation, that person would be immediately, it would be a scandal, they'd be defrocked, there'd be an outcry, and yet Sheikh Zud gets up at Lakemba Mosque and proclaims the need for violence and destruction of Israel. It's just extraordinary. Mark, I want to move to the political implications potentially. The respected political commentator Peter Credlin has written that the Albanese government's policy towards Israel is now being dictated to by the Muslim constituency, particularly these Western Sydney seats where there's a large Muslim population. And in the UK, the former Muslim, now self-professed Christian convert, Ayan Hirsi Ali, has posted on social media this week, and I quote, "Islamist voters give left-wing parties a choice. Join us in trying to destroy Israel or risk losing," end quote. Now, is this the political reality of what we're seeing in Australia?
I think there's been a long partnership between Muslim communities and the left in Australia, and not just with Muslim communities, but many migrant communities as well. And this partnership between radical Islam or radical Islamic aspirations and the left is a long story. It's been going on for decades across the West. I think one reason is, particularly at the more radical end of the left, there's a script that Western civilization is exploitative, that it's colonizing, its success is based on destroying others. I don't think that's true, actually, and in fact, Muslim civilization has been perhaps one of the most, if not the most, aggressive colonizing civilizations on the planet. I mean, the reason why many Palestinians are Muslims is because Islam conquered Palestine and Islamized it and Arabized it. So. So this partnership between the left and radical Islam has been going on for a long time. The problem is you enter into a partnership like this and you have lots of talk fest and you build these relationships, and one day a member of parliament finds that hundreds of Muslims have joined the local party and are now voting in the local party meetings. And then at some point they are asked to pay up. They're asked to support the radical Islamic agenda, and in this case, it is in fact the genocidal agenda to destroy a whole nation, a whole people. So that you kind of, one of the problems is that the reality of you might say the dark side of Islam, the aspects of Islam that are really destructive for human flourishing, this has been suppressed under a narrative of anxiety about Islamophobia, that the real problem is racism against minorities. And it's very, very hard when you have that, you look at the world through that grid to say, well, maybe everyone has problems with evil within. It's not just the rulers or the wealthy that might show evil. I think all sorts of people can be motivated by evil. And I think just joining sides with one group and just saying right or wrong, we're going to be with you without exercising judgment or discernment about what that group is doing or arguing for. I think that's really unwise. But that's the way things have rolled in the West. So yeah, we're in a profound crisis. I think I sometimes wonder whether we're kind of past a tipping point in the West. We're losing touch with our foundations altogether.
Yeah, we certainly are, and this alliance between the radical left and Islam is certainly concerning because it's an anti-Western, anti-Australian values line that they're pushing. But I wonder, Mark, if there's some hope, perhaps, and you might have some thoughts on this. Most Muslims that I meet, and you see a lot in Sydney where I now live, and they're lovely people, they love Australia, they enjoy the lifestyle here. Do you think their love of what Australia has given them might cause them to integrate and to realise that this is a wonderful country, and that they might reject the values of their leaders that we've just been discussing, and that might, in the end, be the hope that they become more Australianised than Islamised?
Well, I think that's true for many Muslims in Australia. That is, even if they do have a strong faith, they want to be in Australia. That's why they came here, and they value the freedoms in Australia, and they like living here, and that they're not a threat to anyone. They just want to get on with their lives and have their families and build their communities. And so many Muslims are like that. But the problem is that the religious strand, the religious element, is deeply wedded to this ancient theological grid, which says that we should return to the purity of Muhammad's example and his way of life. Unfortunately, that includes violent jihad. It includes defeat and conquest of non-Muslims. So there's the problem within Islam. Sometimes people say, well, doesn't Islam need a reformation? And I think the issue is that the reformation's underway, and that it's producing a radical form of Islam. That fundamental challenge for Muslims, that is their own faith, kind of pushes them back to a stance which is opposed to Western way of life. That is not answered really effectively. So, for example, there are two groups of two Grand Muftis and two major organisations of Sunni Muslims in Australia who are inclined to a more radical view of Islam. They have kind of conservative theological agenda, but there's no comparable liberal Islamic movement. There's no kind of pro-Australian Islamic movement in that sense. Yeah. There's no counter to the religious voice, and what's happens then is that the politicians, perhaps because of the nature of their electorate or because they want to reach out to Muslims, when they reach out to Muslims in general, the people that they end up meeting with or engaging with are the religious leaders who have a conservative, sort of, you could call it orthodox but traditionalist view, and so they actually capture a lot of the government's attention. And so there's been, for example, extraordinary amount of work over the last 20 years between the police and Muslim communities to build sensitivity in the police, and there's been so many grants that have been given to Muslim communities, but a lot of all that attention that the Muslim community receives is being funneled through the religious organisations that claim to speak for all Muslims. So the problem is that the Muslim you describe, who's just wants to get on with his life in Australia, even with a strong faith, that sort of presence, that sort of person is not in the spotlight of leadership in the Muslim community, and so that's an inherent problem in the way things have been working.
So you paint a pretty grim picture, Mark, and a grim picture for Australia. But I wonder if a big part of the answer then has to be having the sort of conversations that you and I are having now, and calling out this moral inversion, and that's what it is. If Muslim leaders can't call out rape and massacre and see that as evil, and whatever critique they want to make of Israel, that's fine. But if they can't condemn obvious evil, then we have to talk about that in Australia if we're going to have any social cohesion in this nation, surely.
Yes, we do need to talk about Sharia, Islamic law, the Islamic worldview, and how it shapes people. We need to call out the imams for basically speaking up for jihad, but not for peace. We need to challenge the partnership of Muslim radicals with anarchist leftist radicals who really want to destroy our culture.
Yeah.
We need courage. And fortunately, for example, we've seen on the campuses there are some academics that have that courage and have been speaking up, but there have been others that have been bowing down really and just surrendering to this hatred and prejudice. So we're in the middle of a battle. I hope that the nature of the battle will cause some people to wake up and to realise they need to speak up. It is intimidating. Like this is not an easy battle, and you know, it's not easy to bring to government's attention what's actually being said in the mosques. Sometimes it's as if you're, you know, then this happened in the UK. One TV channel did an undercover mosque investigation which showed incredible hatred being preached in British mosques, and the police began an investigation of the TV company to say that they'd incited hatred by bringing the public's attention what was actually being taught in the mosque. So, yeah, that's kind of scary. You're not only facing perhaps animosity from the Islamic community if you talk about some of what they're saying and what they're promoting, but you also could be targeted by government authorities, you know, who've been trained that they should be fighting Islamophobia. So it's difficult. It's not easy. No,
it's not easy. Well, Mark, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. We should have a much longer discussion, but hopefully this will help do what you say is necessary, and that's help wake people up having these discussions. And I know many Australians are grateful for your voice in this space on other networks and commentary and books you've written, and I really appreciate you giving of your time today with us here on ADH TV.
Thanks, Lyle. Good to meet with you.